Здравствуйте, my washers and dryers. Welcome back to the Laundromat. We continue in our Thicc Nonficc journey through Simon C. Montefiore's Stalin biography, wherein tonight we will be discussing World War II. Russia didn't quite get into World War II right at the get-go. They were involved in a lot of the politics in the late 1930s and early 1940s, but primarily the big thing that we see at the end of the 1930s is this non-aggression pact between Russia and Nazi Germany. And Stalin was fine doing an agreement with Nazi Germany because Stalin wasn't really bothered by the whole internment camp things, and he really wasn't bothered by the whole, segregating the Jewish people and systematically exterminating them. It wasn't because he was biologically racist in the way that the Nazis were, but because he disliked any nationality that threatened loyalty to the multinational USSR. To him, it mattered first if you considered yourself Russian, and if you didn't, then he had a problem with that. Molotov, foreign minister, premier of the country, in fact, went to go and sign the Ribbentrop Pact. Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, in fact, and it was just a non-aggression thing. And there was a lot of annexing that came with that, and the great game, as Molotov called the tournament of nerves between Stalin and Hitler, had begun. Not that this was a tenuous agreement, but we know from history that it didn't last long. While Molotov is being a very good foreign minister, signing treaties, rubbing elbows with the grand elite of Europe, they actually indict Molotov's wife. They arrest Polina and they have to take a vote on that. And Molotov bravely abstained, showing his ability to disagree with Stalin, confidence, and love of Polina. And Vyacheslav Molotov and Polina Molotova, they did have arguably a very beautiful relationship. Their love often came first. Their decisions that they made were always meant to serve lip service to the party, but protect the other person. And we'll actually see that happen a lot, especially in the post-World War II years. With this non-aggression pact, there was some annexation that was supposed to take place. And we get into the Winter War, which was where the USSR invaded Finland, and 3.5 months later, they're like, okay, sorry. And this is where we get the invention of Molotov cocktails. There are several memes, and you may have seen some, like Americans when the forest starts speaking Vietnamese. There are also memes that were for Russians when the tree started speaking Finnish. Because on the 30th of November, 5 Soviet armies attacked along the 800-mile border of Finland. Their frontal assaults on the Mannerheim line were foiled by the ingenious Finns, who, dressed like ghosts in white suits, were slaughtering the Russians. The forests were decorated with frozen pyramids of Soviet corpses. The Finns used 70,000 empty bottles filled with gasoline against the Russians, the first Molotov cocktails. And this stemmed from, the Soviets trying to be like, well, this annexation is good for you. We're going to provide you food, and it's going to be great. And then they started dropping bombs, which the Finns called Molotov bread baskets. And so they were just returning the favor. And again, 3.5 months after the invasion, they just kind of left. So good for Finland. Part of these late 1930s activities is Molotov meets Hitler. And Hitler uses all of these grand theatrics to impress his guests. And Molotov was not fazed. He considered himself a Marxist-Leninist and therefore superior to everyone else, particularly fascists. Hitler would make these demands, or he would ask for things, and Molotov wouldn't give in to it. And so Hitler would get agitated. Molotov persisted and wore him down. So we get some more just kind of negotiations and tensions kind of rising. And we are introduced to General Georgy Zhukov, who's 45, and he was rushed to the Little Corner, where Stalin appointed him chief of staff. Siebeck Montefiore describes him as the quintessential fighting general who had become the greatest captain of the Second World War. The fact that Russia survived at all, the fact that it had any resources after World War II is ridiculous. The fact that it had any people is ridiculous. It's also in this chapter, before we get into the actual, combat stuff, we read a letter that Vasily had sent to Stalin. So one thing I didn't mention earlier, because this figure was not mentioned earlier, is Stalin had another son from a previous marriage. And this son would be captured by Germans and put into a work camp in Germany. And so this son was the brave war hero that Stalin loved, and Vasily joined the Air Force because he was so excited to impress his dad, and he was so excited to prove that he wasn't a screw-up. And Stalin was too busy to really write him back. And so we get a letter from Vasily that says, "Father, write me just a couple of words if you have time. It's the biggest joy for me because I miss you so much. Yavasia." So Vasily is someone that I have to remind myself is not the best person because he was very drunk, very belligerent, very mean-spirited, and just very cruel. But sometimes he was still just a desperate little kid looking for attention from his dad. But so we're in 1941, early 1941 at this point. And Stalin's looking to disarm things, and Zhukov's like, "It's not a good idea," and Zhdanov's, "It's not a good idea." And there's a guy associated with the Air Force as well, named Pavel Ryshigov, and it says he arrived drunk at a meeting to discuss the planes. When Stalin criticized the Air Force, Ryshigov shouted that the death rate was so high because you're making us fly in coffins. And one of the endlessly fascinating things about Russia in World War II is their equipment was garbage. Their equipment was decades old, barely worked. Right at the end of this part, the Germans would start bombing Russia. They would start dropping bombs on Sebastopol, and they're like, "Someone call Stalin," and they're like, "We're not going to be the ones to do it because he's asleep right now." And so we go into 1941 and 1942. Both Hitler and Stalin are probably asleep when German bombs start dropping on Sebastopol, which violates the Ribbentrop Pact, so non-aggression is out the window now. Molotov, when he finds out that the Germans are dropping bombs on Russia, is furious. He says this is a breach of confidence unprecedented in history. He negotiated that contract and they can't just go back on it. Everyone is panicking. They don't know what to do. And Sebag Montefiore says only Zhukov, brutal, courageous, and energetic, managed to counterattack on the southwestern front, brandishing the Stalinist ruthlessness that distinguished him throughout the war. One of the things that the Germans did in their first big sweep through of Russia is they blew up all of the airfields. And so they were starting from a severe disadvantage. Stalin was absorbing the scale of the catastrophe. The fronts were out of control. The Nazis were approaching Minsk. The Air Force decimated. 30 divisions shattered. And again, everyone's like, we don't know what to do. We don't want to make a suggestion to Stalin because that makes it seem like we're trying to usurp. And Zhukov's getting tired of it because he's like, we have to do something. He starts yelling at members of the Politburo, to which Beria shouts, "We too are capable of giving orders." And Zhukov says, "If you think you can do it, do it." And Beria says, "If the party tells us to, we will." And this is honestly a thing that will distinguish Zhukov throughout his career, is he's not going to take anything from anyone, not even the leaders of his own government. He will step up to the plate to kind of deal with this crisis, even if no one else will deal with it. The big operation in Russia is called Operation Barbarossa. And despite the fact that within 3 weeks of the war, Russia had lost around 2 million men, 3,500 tanks, and over 6,000 aircraft, the Germans broke through to take another 300,000 Red Army prisoners, but none of Barbarossa's objectives, Moscow, Leningrad, and the Donetsk Basin, had fallen. Millions of people died, but the operation as a whole is still a failure, and that is going to cost Hitler dearly moving forward. Because he didn't commit, he got overconfident, and we'll see that overconfidence play out again. But it's during this time, during this kind of early conquest of Russia, that Stalin's son, Yakov, is captured and taken to a work camp. He was put in a very difficult position because he knew where his son was, but he couldn't have him traded because his son, Yakov, was just another soldier. It wasn't like his son was a captain or any sort of commanding officer, and he couldn't display any favoritism by prioritizing his own son's safety over the safety of another soldier. He did ban Vasily from all flying missions, saying 1 prisoner is more than enough for me, but that's really as far as he could go. But we'll see that the choices of having to leave his son in a prisoner of war camp would really hurt. We get into the siege of Leningrad. There are 2 big things in the Russian front of World War II that are big deals. And one of them is the siege of Leningrad and the Battle of Stalingrad. And so Ferocious as a Dog gets into Zhdanov and the siege of Leningrad. And it says Zhukov and Zhdanov succeeded in making the storming of Leningrad very costly for the Germans. Hitler hesitated, canceled the assault, and ordered instead that Leningrad be starved into submission and razed to the ground. The 900-day siege of the city had begun. Between the start of the siege and July 1942, it's estimated that 1 million people died. people were eating each other. There was cannibalism in Leningrad, which is horrifying to think about. And it is such a demoralizing, awful slog to maintain the city. And Zhdanov, he's faced with impossible decisions, and he says, I'd have done the same thing, he admitted, and he ordered the evacuation of the children. And after the war, he was quoted as saying that people died like flies, but history would never have forgiven me had I given up Leningrad. And because he didn't, they stood a chance, and the Germans started turning their attentions toward Moscow. Also, when I say the Germans turn their attention toward Moscow, I am briskly walking through this section. If you want to read more in-depth stuff about Russia and World War II, by all means do that, but this is not meant to be comprehensive at all, just as an aside. Okay. Can we hold Moscow? That's the big question that one of the chapters is trying to answer. And visitors were amazed by Zhukov's tone. He spoke to Stalin in sharp, commanding tones as if he was the superior officer, and Stalin accepted this. I think Stalin was happy to have an expert weigh in on what to do. So they're like, all right, we're going to hold Moscow. We're not going to let the Germans take over. What do we have? He's like, we have reserves. And the general's like, reserves? You expect us to save the city with reserves? And Stalin says any idiot could defend the city with reserves. And Stalin generously gave the officer 15 tanks. And Malenkov is standing in the background, and he's like, that's all we have left. So in just a few months, all of the military resources that Russia had were reduced to 15 tanks. We're just in 1942, and they have 15 tanks to hold out to the end. With those diminishing resources, we get into the next chapter, Molotov in London, Meklis in the Crimea, and Khrushchev in collapse. There was like a back and forth, and Stalin was going to try an offensive, but that offensive ended up being a trap. And he called off the offensive, and it was too late, though. The exhilarated Germans, it says, pushed on towards the Volga and the Caucasus. The road to Stalingrad was open. But Hitler got cocky, and he divided his forces in two. One pushed across the Don to Stalingrad, while the other headed southwards towards those Caucasian oil fields. So much like a lot of Operation Barbarossa, where the objectives weren't met, but Russia still suffered heavy casualties, Stalingrad was kind of the same way. Over 2 million Russians died just at Stalingrad, but the Soviet Union won, and that marked a huge turning point in the war. So we get into part 8, which is the last part of this section, and it gets into Stalin's and the Politburo's children during the war, and we get a little bit more about Yakov and his experiences in the POW camp. On April 14th, he refused to cooperate with the Germans, and he threw himself on the camp wire and died. I think Stalin kind of carried that with him for the rest of his life, but he was kind of at a loss of what to do. But towards the end of this section, we get the creation of a new Soviet national anthem, which Stalin raved parts the sky and heaven like a boundless wave. And yes, it is absolutely the song you're thinking. So the whole idea of the way they wrote the Soviet national anthem was really interesting. There was like a whole song contest, and there was a thing with the lyrics where one word for like fight sounded a whole lot like a word for fornicate, and so they would try to sing the song, and they kept giggling about it. This actually segues into a very nice invitation. There's a cool video, I'll link it down in the description, about the composer Shostakovich, who was a composer during this time and had to deal with a lot of the censorship. But Shostakovich was a very important composer during this time. My friend Tucker shared a video with me about his quest to compose during this time. So I'll link that down in the description. I just thought that the stuff about the song was a nice segue into that topic. We get into Yalta and Berlin and the conferences of Stalin meeting Roosevelt and Churchill and meeting to decide what to do after World War II. He had a lot of respect for Churchill, but he really liked Roosevelt, and they got along really well. And there's a really cool story on 484 about how Europe would be handled. And it's told through the idea that there's a bear that England, Russia, and America were hunting. Both Westerners stand accused of selling out Eastern Europe to Stalin. Roosevelt's courtship of Stalin and discourtesy to Churchill were misguided. FDR was certainly ill and exhausted, but Stalin always believed that force would decide who ruled Eastern Europe, which was occupied by 10 million Soviet soldiers. He himself told an anecdote after the war which reveals his view of Yalta. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin went hunting, Stalin said. They finally killed their bear. Churchill said, I'll take the bear skin. Let Roosevelt and Stalin divide the meat. Roosevelt said, no, I'll take the skin. Let Churchill and Stalin divide the meat. Stalin remained silent, so Churchill and Roosevelt asked him, Mr. Stalin, what do you say? Stalin simply replied, the bear belongs to me. After all, I killed it. The bear is Hitler, and the bear skin is Eastern Europe. That kind of gives an indication of what kind of mindset Stalin's in. And he's like, we won the war for you, so we're out here. We're Eastern Europe. Let us rule it. It blows my mind that they even had 10 million soldiers to occupy anything, because by the end of the war, Russia had lost a grand total of 24 million people. And that's, military, civilians, whatever. 24 million people died. The only other country that came close to those kinds of numbers was China. Russia's losses were staggering. So I'm not surprised that Stalin was like, give me the damn bear skin. It's mine. That takes us to the end of the war. But we are up to part 9, which will lead us through the post-World War II fallout and the succession of who will come after Stalin, which only the truly modest would ever dare suggest that they were qualified for. This has been a good part. I realize I walked through that really briskly, but there's a lot of information to cover in just a very short amount of time, honestly. Again, there are tons of really cool resources about World War II in Russia, and I'll attach some links and some images of just some examples of stuff that, whether dramatized or serializes or explains in greater depth what World War II from the Russian front was like. It's interesting to get into Russian World War II history specifically because we get a lot of World War II history from the American perspective or from like the German perspective, and Russia's just kind of there, lurking in the background, very large and very scary. And a lot of it is very messed up, but World War II as a whole was very messed up. And so if you want to learn more about Russian World War II history beyond like the Night Witches, again, check out the resources down in the description. I did finish the book on time. I do want to point out that I did finish the book. I finished it right on July 31st, so cutting it really close to the corners, but did finish it. So another successful thick nonfic for the books. And again, thank you so much for watching. Make sure when you're taking your fitted sheet from the washer to the dryer that you make sure nothing got stuck in there. So I hope that goes well for you. I hope you're having a lovely evening, and I will see you all next time.